or IJT, discuss storytelling through different mediums. For those of you curious about this cryptic title, stay tuned to the end of the podcast and I'll explain it then. This week I will be discussing storytelling through music, specifically from one piece, The Butterfly Lovers Violin Concerto by He Zanhao and Cheng Gang. Not particularly lyrical music like pop songs or other songs we hear on the radio, but completely instrumental, orchestral classical music. Which raises the core question of this podcast: how does a non-lyrical piece of music tell a story without any words? Before we delve into the realm of storytelling, some context on the concerto and the story it tells. This violin concerto is based on a Chinese legend called The Butterfly Lovers, a story very similar to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but has been around significantly longer. There's also a hint of Mulan in there as well, the 1998 Disney one. And I say this particular version because the original legend, that dates back to 500 AD-ish, the original legend doesn't require that she hides her identity. In fact, her parents were supportive of her going to war in her father's place. The story begins with our female protagonist, Zhu Yingtai, and a synopsis of her childhood. At the start of the story, she declares to her father that she wants to pursue an education, something that was at the time reserved for men only, proposing to disguise and enroll as a man. I guess hope you can see here that there's a little hint of Mulan. But here, the difference is that her father agrees and allows her to leave, rather than her sneaking off on her own. This is the backstory prior to the beginning of the piece. On the road to Hangzhou for her studies, she meets Liang Shanbo, another scholar who is going to study at Hangzhou as well. Real quick, in Asian culture, the family name comes before their personal name. So Zhu Yingtai, her first name, by American standards, is actually Yingtai, and her family surname is Zhu. Same goes with Liang Shanbo. So Liang is his surname, Shanbo would be his first name. Now the two of them quickly form a strong bond, taking an oath of fraternity during their journey together. The next moments fly by as time passes faster for Zhu Yingtai. Almost instantly, 3 busy years of school pass, and their bond grows even stronger. Liang is none the wiser to his best friend's true identity, and Zhu is falling deeper and deeper in love with him, but she is called to return home by her parents. Liang escorts her back home on an 18-mile trek. Zhu keeps dropping hints that she is, in fact, a woman. Of course, he doesn't notice any of these advances, and as a last resort, Zhu offers to play matchmaker with Liang and her sister. Here's the catch. She doesn't have a sister. She is referring to herself. She invites him to her home to court the sister, which he doesn't do for many months, but when he does, he finds Zhu no longer in disguise. Now, this sounds like a romantic love story, but what is a love story without some conflict? Turns out her father had already arranged a marriage for her to some rich boy. Heartbroken, Liang becomes critically ill, and he dies soon after. Supposedly, the day of Zhu's wedding with the rich boy, she visits Liang's grave and she pays her respects at that gravesite. And with a loud crack of thunder and lightning, his grave opens and she falls inside, committing suicide. Touched by this bond between them two, the gods blessed their souls, turning them into butterflies to fly together forever. To read the story yourself, see the description below under Butterfly Lovers, the Chinese Romeo and Juliet. I wouldn't be surprised if Shakespeare heard the story and built Romeo and Juliet off of it. But how does He Zanhao and Cheng Gang tell the story through a violin concerto of all things? That is the question, isn't it? Now, for some historical context to start, this concerto was written in 1959 China during the Cultural Revolution, and as such, it really didn't come to light until the 1980s. For those unfamiliar with Chinese history, the Cultural Revolution was a political movement that Mao Zedong used to gain control of China by radicalizing the youth population, essentially priming them to hunt down quote-unquote intellectuals and allies of the West. So, in essence, it's an anti-West movement. And with melodies originating from Chinese operas and traditional folk songs, plus Western orchestration, it becomes easy to see why this concerto, as a synthesis of both Eastern and Western musical cultures, might be suppressed for about 20 years. The piece utilizes the pentatonic scale, which is used in classical Chinese pieces instead of tonal harmonies commonly found in Western classical music. Even more so, the violin solo engages in very unique playing styles to emulate Chinese instruments, particularly the erhu, a 2-stringed instrument very similar to the cello, both in playing style and register. Now, surprisingly, the answer is not as difficult, as storytelling tends to follow the same mediums no matter what form it takes: films, books, music, etc. And they're all connected with motifs. Now, what is a motif? A motif is a recurring idea, concept, or theme in which other ideas revolve around. In music, they are called leitmotifs and are normally associated with a character, scene, or a theme. Now, they're always present in films and TV shows, whether you realize it. For example, James Bond, the 007 theme, we are all familiar with it. In fact, I'm sure someone right now is singing it in their head. It is associated with James Bond, the legendary spy. And every time we hear that theme, we think of him, whether it's being played in the film or outside the theater. Another famous example, the Pink Panther theme. We all know that one too. In the list of leitmotifs we are familiar with can pile on and on. The Avengers theme, Jack Sparrow's theme from Pirates of the Caribbean, Princess Leia's theme from Star Wars, Hakuna Matata means no worries for the rest of your day, Lion King. Again, leitmotifs are musical representations associated with these characters, scenes, or themes. In this piece in particular, the violin soloist is clearly the leitmotif of the protagonist, Zhu Yingtai, and I'll play a little passage right here so you know what she sounds like. Now, whenever we see the soloist play, they are essentially speaking on behalf of the character, kind of like how actors play characters in operas, films, musicals, and the such. Now, another interesting component is how the music is structured. Most classical music forms follow a simple pattern: ternary form, ABA, rondo form, ABACA, and there are so many more out there. This concerto, however, doesn't follow any of them, I guess, to the bone, to the structure. It is a single movement piece with 7 different sections: Adagio cantabile, Allegro, Adagio assai doloroso, and this next one is all 3 of them are in one section: Pesante, piumoso, duramente, lagrimoso, presto risoluto, and lastly, Adagio cantabile. Now, if a form had to be chosen in the end, I would say that this violin concerto follows a similar pattern as the sonata form, which is exposition, development, and recapitulation, which actually follows a story structure. In storytelling, we can all agree that there is a beginning, middle, and end, and this is called the 3-act structure. And now I hope you can kind of see the resemblance of the 3-act structure to the sonata form. Where the story begins, we have our beginning, our exposition. Then the story develops in the middle section. And in the Butterfly Lovers Violin Concerto, we have the Adagio cantabile as our exposition/beginning that sets the scene and shows our main character entering. Everything between here and the end, which I'll talk about in a moment, is the development/the middle. The drama we encounter, the romantic misfortunes, these are all the development of the story. The story, of course, ends with the death. But the musical form still considers it as part of the development. The recapitulation is not an ending, but more of a quick summation of what happens and informs us, the readers, the listeners, what happens post-story, their transformation into butterflies. So this story structure actually follows sonata form more than the normal 3-act structure, slightly deviating away from it. Now, after the death of the main characters, the story could just stop right there, but it doesn't. Instead, there is a recap. If you haven't noticed, the first section and the very last section, they're both Adagio cantabile. What goes around comes around in a nice circle. The story and the music ends with a recap and the revelation of their butterfly transformation post-death scene. So it's more like a recap plus an epilogue. Moreover, the final note of the violin solo is a harmonic D, despite the piece being in G major, so this feeling of not ending on the tonic prevents this sense of closure, which I feel accurately reflects the end of the story, and you're going to hear it right now in a second. So, as you heard, the story of the butterfly lovers don't end in death. During the recap, we see their souls become transformed, and they both fly away together. The story still continues, as these butterflies, but the chapter in which their human lives have come to comes to a close. So now, if we branch away from the strict rules of storytelling and music writing, we can dig a little deeper and think about it in a different level. All stories hold symbolism in some form or another. Black typically represents evil or death, white, purity and innocence, red, violence and anger, etc. But what kind of symbolism can we see through the music? Now Chen Gang and He Zhanhao do this masterfully by hiding it in the playing style of the violin soloist. If you listen to any performance of this piece, you will notice a lot of these throbbing slides and extremely wide vibratos, which is not Western at all, which makes you kind of wonder, why do you think this was done this way? This playing style that we hear is very similar, actually, to the musical playing style of the erhu, and I brought this up briefly earlier. If you don't remember, it is a two-stringed instrument, very similar to the cello in playing style and register. And you actually might be more familiar with its sound than you think. The famous cartoon movie, Kung Fu Panda, features it in one of the most iconic scenes in probably cartoon history. In the scene of Master Oogway's farewell, he tells Shufu to believe in Po before disappearing in a flurry of peach blossoms. Now, Oogway Ascends, the name of the soundtrack written by Hans Zimmer. Ooh, fan of Hans Zimmer. The erhu accompanies this scene and this soundtrack. Now, anyway, back to the main question. What's the big deal about the violin imitating the erhu? Well, we know that Zhu Tai, she disguises herself as a male in the beginning, and we also know that the violin is a very high register instrument. Now, what can we infer from these pieces of information? That's the crucial point. Now, if we look back at the previous question, what's the deal with the violin imitating the erhu? Well, it has a lower register, and when the violin imitates it, could it be possible that it is reflecting that Zhu is pretending to be a guy? That the violin is pretending to be a lower register instrument? So Zhu, a woman, pretending to be a man with a lower register voice? Maybe. The composers never tell us directly, but it is an intriguing symbol of disguised femininity. I hope I said that right. And you can hear it from the same example that I showed you earlier with Zhu Tai's leitmotif. Now we come to the last item on my list, association. Many stories that are told are not 100% original, sometimes drawing from pre-existing sources that quote-unquote inspire it. We already understand the story that is being told, and thus we can make associations between the story itself and the music. For the Butterfly Lovers Violin Concerto, I had to read the story and the music score, among other sources, while listening to the music, to associate how the story fits and is being told through the music. The birdsong twitter from the flute in the beginning sets the scene. Aggressive virtuosic allegro runs during her school days, a romantic duet between the violin solo representing Zhu and the solo cello representing Liang. Now the solo cello is the principal seat, the first chair of the cello section. And by understanding the program, we understand the story itself and the way the music tells the story. If we look at examples aside from my sample, the Pied Piper, it's a folktale that we are all familiar with and or heard of. The Pied Piper of Hamelin is a magical flutist who kidnaps, hypnotizes all the children of a village and runs off with them when they did not hold up when the village people did not hold up their end of a bargain. Now, in a flute solo and orchestra adaptation in the 20th century, contemporary American composer John Corigliano, winner of 5 Grammys, an Oscar, a Pulitzer, and many other prestigious awards, he utilizes many different musical devices, in a matter of speaking, to reflect certain aspects of the story. An oboist wetting down the reed imitated the shrieking of rats. Overpressure of cello bows on string produced this toneless, tearing sound that overwhelms the orchestra and it represents the rats that the Pied Piper controls. And furthermore, in the end, they got the children to come out of the audience and follow the soloist off stage. Although this is more of a theatrical expression rather than music telling the story, but in a way, I guess you could say music is telling a story in that way. Point is, in the retelling of a story that used to have a form of some textual basis, by already knowing the story and becoming familiar with it, we can associate the scenes and the moments we know with those scenes and moments with the music. The actions and scenes of the story is personified, in a matter of speaking, through the music. And by hearing certain parts, we go, oh, this scene is happening right now, and we understand what is going on musically. As a cellist of 13 years, an orchestra musician of 10 years, and a chamber musician of 4 years, I know that when listening to big pieces like the Concerto, for instance, in order to understand how all the parts play into the performance, you have to look at the score. To properly identify the storytelling aspects and the associations, contexts, and personifications, I personally don't think it is enough to just know the story and what the music sounds like. For any of the non-musicians out there, a score is a large piece of sheet music containing all the vocal and instrumental parts of the music arranged next to one another so you can see what the other parts are playing and doing in relation to the other instruments. While the flute is playing its little bird song intro, who else is playing? Well, unless you want to go listen to the recording several hundred times, playing back the last 5 seconds just to figure out what's going on in the background, I can just look at the score and tell you what the only other instruments that are playing at that time is the harp and the strings as a drone bass. Simply knowing who is playing at each time helps you identify specifically what is going on in the scene, or who is being present there or quiet in the background, etc. The score helps with that and kind of serves as a little cheat sheet for the entire piece. Furthermore, sometimes the intention of the composers are more noticeable on the scores because sometimes they will intentionally write the music in a certain way or ask that so-and-so plays their instrument in a certain way to produce a certain musical effect, kind of like Corigliano. There are probably other methods and techniques used in storytelling that I wasn't able to get to in this podcast recording, but I believe the four I mentioned above are the biggest ones that I've noticed. As a big thank you for listening to this podcast, I would like to reward you with the hidden meaning of the podcast's name. If you look very carefully at the name of the episode art, you may notice that the way it is written is very odd. And it's like that for good reason. If you turn the image upside down, you'll notice that it spells something else. MIOSOUL becomes Music 141, the name of the class that this project is being created for. In conjunction with this topic, sometimes the most entertaining part of finding these correlations between music and storytelling are the millions and different ways to approach a single idea. At first glance, if I had said nothing about the title, you might have thought nothing of it. Or he might have his reasons, or he's probably just bad at art design. But if you look at it from a different perspective, upside down, you will notice that it actually spells the class name. Of course, if you aren't familiar with this class, what might it mean? Was it intentional that He Zhanhao and Cheng Gang had the violin soloist play similar styles to traditional Chinese instruments? If it was it an attempt to blend Eastern and Western music styles? Or was there a deeper meaning behind it, an artistic ornamentation to emphasize the falsity of her manhood? Or it's an early address to gender identity? Who knows? It could be interpreted in different ways, of course, but it's only when we question and meditate on these ideas that we can create these correlations and perhaps discover something that was not there before. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, if allowed, leave a like below, drop a comment below, let me know if you've enjoyed it, and maybe, just maybe, I'll come back in the future and do another one. Whenever that may be, next week or never, thank you for joining me for this podcast episode. Thank you for listening.